And I am joined by our liturgist and videographer, Michelle Coleman. And behind the scenes, we have Melanie Coleman, who puts everything together and uploads to YouTube. Now today we're going to continue our sermon series about the women in Jesus' genealogy. It's based on a book called Significant by Rachel Risner. Now God chose 6 ordinary women who all had train-wrecked lives, kind of like most of us, and used these women to bring about Jesus' birth. They were Jesus' foremothers. And today we're going to look at the life of the 5th mother in Jesus' genealogy, and her name is Ruth. So let's join together in a spirit of worship by singing our opening prayer together. God, we pray for tenacity, determination, patience, and strength as we wait for your will in our lives, as Ruth did. You will do more than we could ever ask, think, imagine, dream, or hope for. We thank you for your blessings while we wait. Amen. Now today we're going to continue to order our service a little differently. We're dividing Ruth's stories into 5 parts, and so we will put the scriptures and the message in 5 parts as well. So we'll start with part number 1. For Ruth, no Moabites allowed.
Our scripture is from Matthew 1 through 5. The family tree of Jesus Christ, David's son, Abraham's son. Abraham had Isaac. Isaac had Jacob. Jacob had Judah and his brothers. Judah had Perez and Zerah. The mother was Tamar. Perez had Hezron. Hezron had Aram. Aram had Amminadab. Amminadab had Nahshon. Nahshon had Salmon. Salmon had Boaz. His mother was Rahab. And Boaz had Obed. Ruth was the mother. Ruth, chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Once upon a time, it was back in the days when judges led Israel. There was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah left home to live in the country of Moab. He and his wife and his 2 sons. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. His sons were named Mahlon and Chilion, all from Bethlehem in Judea. They all went to the country of Moab and settled there. Naomi's husband died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Her sons married Moabite women named Oprah and Ruth. They lived in Moab for the next 10 years, but then Naomi's sons died. She was left without either her young men or her husband. Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 3 to 6. No Ammonite or Moabite is to enter the congregation of God, even to the 10th generation, nor any of his children, ever. Those nations didn't treat you with hospitality on your travels out of Egypt. On top of that, they also hired Balaam to curse you. God turned the curse into a blessing. How God, your God, loves you. Don't even try to get along with them or do anything for them ever.
Ruth, part 1, no Moabites allowed. Now you have probably heard of our biblical heroine for today. Her name was Ruth, because she's one of only 2 women who have a book of the Bible named after that, along with Esther. But before we start Ruth's story, let's take a closer look at her people's past, which shaped who she was. Now, Ruth was a Moabite woman, and she married into a Jewish family. The family had fled to Moab from their hometown of Bethlehem because of a famine. I love that Bethlehem is in this story because it's so important to Jesus later on, and there's roots right here in Ruth's story. Now, you might think that a Jew marrying a Moabite is, well, no big deal. I mean, you wouldn't care if your son married a woman from Illinois or Minnesota, would you? Well, maybe some of you would, but you get the idea. It wouldn't be that big of a deal. But to the Jewish people, it was a big, terrible deal if you married a Moabite. In Deuteronomy, we learned that God excluded Moabites from worshiping with the Jews forever. That's what that phrase, even to the 10th generation, that's what that phrase means. Basically, it's not going to happen, ever. God made the strictest restrictions against Ruth's people, the Moabites. But why? Now, there's two reasons. God spelled it out. The first was the Moabites hadn't been nice to the Israelites when they were escaping Egypt, and they didn't give them any food, any bread or water. And the second reason was that the Moabites had hired Balaam to curse the Israelite people. Now, not giving the escaping Israelites any food or water is really rotten behavior. But what about this Balaam guy? Who is he, and what's this about a curse? Well, Balaam was like the Aaron Rodgers or the Tom Brady of prophets. He was simply the best pagan prophet there was. And I know I've probably stirred up some reactions to you about those quarterbacks because you probably have a different favorite, but you got the idea. You know, he was good. So the Moabite king summoned Balaam to curse the Israelite people. Now, this may seem strange, but the Israelites were coming out of Egypt and settling in the land right next door, right across the river from the Moabites. The king knew that they were powerful people because their God had just parted the Red Sea and allowed his people to cross on dry land. The king knew he was dealing with a powerful people who had a mighty God, and he was scared. So the pagan prophet Balaam traveled to the king on a donkey. Now, this was a pretty common way to get around in those days. While he was traveling, he was stopped by God's angel 3 times. Now, unfortunately, at this time, only the donkey could see the angel. Balaam couldn't see him. So the donkey kept stopping. Every time the donkey stopped, Balaam would beat the poor donkey. Finally, after the 3rd beating, God miraculously allowed the donkey to talk. And the donkey basically told Balaam to knock it off. And then all of a sudden, Balaam's eyes were open. He could see the angel of God. He confessed his sins. And then he kind of think, well, this is going to have a happy ending. Well, it did for a little while, because now it was time for Balaam to curse the Israelites. Remember, that's what the reason for him going there even was? But when he tried to curse, he could only speak the words that God put into his mouth. So here he is standing in front of everybody and the king and get ready to do this curse. And this is what came out of his mouth. God will crush the foreheads of Moab, which is his people, but Israel will grow strong. Well, this was like a reverse curse, wasn't it? Can you imagine how frustrated both Balaam and the king were to hear God's words instead of the curse against the Israelites that they had expected? You know, God knew that these Moabites were such a bad influence that God wanted the Israelite people to avoid them. So we might wonder, why in the world would God use a Moabite woman to further Jesus Christ's genealogy? And yet, that is exactly what God did. We'll learn that Ruth's tenacity changed history. Ruth, Part 2, Grieving and Going Home.
Ruth chapter 1, verses 6 to 19. Ruth had heard that the famine was over in Bethlehem, so she started out, her 2 daughter-in-laws with her, on the road back to the land of Judah. After a short while on the road, Naomi told her 2 daughter-in-laws, "Go back, go home and live with your mothers, and may God treat you as graciously as you treated your deceased husbands and me. May God give each of you a new home and a new husband." She kissed them, and they cried openly. They said, "No, we're going on with you to your people." But Naomi was firm. "Go back, my dear daughters. This is a bitter pill for me to swallow, more bitter for me than for you." Again, they cried openly. Oprah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth embraced her and held on. Naomi said, "Look, your sister-in-law is going back home to live with her own people and God's. Go with her." But Ruth said, "Don't force me to leave you. Don't make me go home. Where you go, I go. Where you live, I live. Your people are my people. Your God is my God. Where you die, I'll die. And that's where I'll be buried. So help me, God. Not even death itself is going to come between us. When Naomi saw that Ruth had her heart set on going with her, she gave in, and so the two of them traveled on together to Bethlehem.
So there had been this huge famine in the little town of Bethlehem, where Naomi and her husband Elimelech, well, they lived with their 2 sons. The situation had to be desperate. Otherwise, this Israelite family would never have moved to the land of the Moabites, the people that they were supposed to avoid like the plague. But despite this move to Moab to save his family's lives from starvation, Elimelech, the husband and father, he soon died. And Naomi found herself living as a widow with her 2 sons in a foreign land. Well, before long, Naomi's 2 boys, they married Moabite women, and their names were Ruth and Orpah. Another big no-no. The family lived together in Moab for 10 years when tragedy struck again. Naomi's 2 sons died, leaving the 3 women, Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah, as widows with no children to support them. Well, soon after these deaths, Naomi learned that the famine was over in her hometown of Bethlehem. So she decided she was going to travel back with her daughters-in-law. But as soon as they started walking, Naomi realized, I shouldn't force my daughters-in-law to travel back to my home. So she said to them, go back. Go home to your people and your gods. May God give each of you a new home and a new husband. Naomi encouraged them, even though it would mean that, her life would be much harder. Orpah, well, she took Naomi up on her offer and returned to her Moabite family and her gods. But shrewd Ruth, she knew that the Lord was the true God, and she wanted to pursue a relationship with God, even though it meant she would have a tough road ahead of her. She clung on to Naomi and told her, where you go, I go, and where you live, I'll live. Your people are my people, and your God is my God. Wow, such faith. Ruth, she chose the Lord. She was at a fork in the road. She chose the narrow path, even though she knew it was going to be more challenging. But tenacious Ruth knew it would be worth it. Ruth, part 3, outstanding in the field.
Ruth chapter 1, verses 20 to Ruth chapter 2, verse 23. Naomi and Ruth arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. It so happened that Naomi had a relative by marriage, a prominent and rich man named Boaz. One day Ruth said to Naomi, I'm going out to glean among the sheaves, following her after some harvesters who will treat me kindly. Naomi said, go ahead, dear daughter. And so she started gleaning in a field owned by Boaz. Boaz asked his foreman, who is this young woman? The foreman said, why, that's the Moabite girl, the one who came with Naomi. She asked permission and has been at it steady ever since. Then Boaz spoke to Ruth, stay close to my young woman. I've given orders to my servants not to harass you. When you get thirsty, feel free to go and drink from the water buckets. She dropped to her knees, then bowed her face to the ground. How does this happen that you should pick me out and treat me so kindly, me, a foreigner? Boaz answered her, I've heard about the way you treated your mother-in-law after the death of her husband, and how you left your father and mother and the land of your birth and have come to live among a bunch of total strangers. God reward you well for what you've done. She said, oh, sir, such grace, such kindness. I don't deserve it. At the lunch break, Boaz said to her, come over here, eat some bread, dip it in the wine. She ate her fill, and she even had some left over. Ruth gleaned until evening. She ended up with nearly a full sack of barley. She went back to town and showed her mother-in-law the results of her day's work. She also gave her the leftovers from her lunch. So Ruth gleaned in the fields daily until both the barley and wheat harvestings were finished, and she continued living with her mother-in-law. Leviticus chapter 23, verse 22. When you reap the harvest of your land, don't reap the corners of your field or gather the gleanings. Leave them for the poor and the foreigners. I am God, your God.
Ruth part 3, outstanding in the field. God was about to provide for two destitute, hungry widows, Ruth and Naomi. You see, God had created a law to feed Israelites' hungriest people, the orphans, the widows, and the foreigners. And God expected his people to be generous to the less fortunate. And God said, when you harvest of your land, leave those edges for the poor and the foreigner living among you. Remember, you were once slaves in Egypt, and I delivered you. Be generous to those in need, and I will bless you. Ruth and Naomi arrived in Bethlehem in time for the harvest, and Ruth was a go-getter, ready to work to keep their bellies full. When Ruth set out to work in the fields one morning, God was ready to intersect her path with the path of another godly person. Ruth ended up in Boaz's field unknowingly. She simply was looking for a generous Israelite who would allow her to glean in his field. Because even though God made this rule, not every farmer followed it, so she was grateful to find one. But God had intentionally led Ruth to Boaz's field. Boaz, a man of good reputation, a godly man, and the son of last week's heroine, Rahab. But it gets even better. Boaz was a relative. He happened to be related to Naomi's deceased husband's family. He was generous and compassionate, and he went beyond the letter of God's law, allowing Ruth to have safety by asking her to stay with his women, and then offering her water in addition to grain. Why was Boaz so kind to a Moabite woman? Well, perhaps because his own mother Rahab was a Moabite. You know, God has a way of bringing together people to fulfill his purpose. Because of Ruth's tenacious loyalty to her mother-in-law, she was about to go from poverty-stricken widow to a foremother of Jesus. Ruth part 4, Midnight at the Threshing Floor.
Ruth chapter 3. One day, Naomi said to Ruth, "My dear daughter, isn't it about time I arranged a good home for you so you can have a happy life? And isn't Boaz our close relative? Maybe it's time to make our move. Tonight is the night of Boaz's barley harvest at the threshing floor. Take a bath, put on some perfume, get all dressed up, and go to the threshing floor. When you see him slipping off to sleep, watch where he lies down and go there. Lie at his feet and let him know that you are available to him for marriage. Then wait and see what he says. He'll tell you what to do." Ruth went down to the threshing floor and put her mother-in-law's plan into action. Boaz had a good time, eating and drinking his fill. He felt great. Then he went off to get some sleep, laying down at the end of a stack of barley. Ruth quietly followed. She lay down to signal her availability for marriage. In the middle of the night, the man was suddenly startled and sat up. "What in the world? This woman asleep at his feet?" he said. "And who are you?" She said, "I am Ruth, your maiden. Take me under your protecting wing. You're my close relative. You do have the right to marry me." He said, "God bless you. What a splendid expression of love. And when you could have had your pick of any of the young men around. Everybody in town knows what a courageous woman you are, a real prize. You're right, I am close relative to you, but there is one even closer than I am. So stay the rest of the night. In the morning, if he wants to exercise his customary rights and responsibilities as the closest covenant redeemer, he'll have his chance. But if he isn't as interested, as God lives, I'll do it. Now go back to sleep until morning. Ruth slept at his feet until dawn, but she got up while it was still dark and wouldn't be recognized, and he said, "No one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor."
Ruth, part 4, Midnight at the Threshing Floor. You know, Ruth and Naomi, they were very familiar with the Levirate law, in which God provides for a childless widow, in fact, a sonless widow, by remarrying her to a relative of her late husband. This could be a brother, a son, or whichever relative wants to marry the widow. Well, knowing this law, Naomi saw a golden opportunity that she just had to grasp. She told Ruth, "I must find you a husband." She said, "Tonight is Boaz's barley harvest at the threshing floor. Freshen up, go to the threshing floor. When he falls asleep, lie down at his feet. That way he'll know that you're ready for marriage and available, and then see what he says." Well, Ruth assured Naomi that she would follow her instructions to the T. She got all prettied up, she headed for the threshing floor, where she secretly waited until Boaz fell asleep, and then she laid at his feet. Now, this might seem like a really strange custom, but laying at Boaz's feet was the least scandalous choice for her midnight encounter. Because to lay at Boaz's feet was to show him that she was his humble servant. Boaz awoke in the middle of the night, startled and surprised to see a woman at his feet, and Ruth simply said, "I am your servant, Ruth." Then she asked him to provide for her and Naomi through a levirate marriage. She was discreetly reminding Boaz in private that he had a family obligation to take care of. Boaz recognized Ruth as a humble, hardworking, and loyal woman. He knew he would be blessed to have her as a wife. Boaz also overlooked her Moabite upbringing and her impoverished widow status. He saw her for who she was. God sees us for who we are. Others might see us for what we look like on the outside. You know, it might be our appearance, our social status, or our reputation, but God saw the tenacious Ruth as a precious crown of gold, and that is how Boaz saw her too. And our final part, Ruth part 5, the famine's fairy tale ending.
Ruth chapter 4. Boaz went straight to the public square and took his place there. Before long, the closer relative, the one mentioned earlier by Boaz, strolled by. "Step aside, old friend," said Boaz. "Take a seat." The man sat down. Boaz then gathered 10 of the town elders together and said, "Sit down here with us. We've got some business to take care of." And they sat down. Boaz then said to his relative, "The piece of property that belonged to our relative, Elimelech, is being sold by his widow, Naomi, who has just returned from the country of Moab. I thought you ought to know about it. Buy it back if you want. You can make it official in the presence of those sitting here and before the town elders. You have first redeemer rights. If you don't want it, tell me so I'll know where I stand. You're first in line to do this, and I'm next after you." He said, "I'll buy it." Then Boaz added, "You realize that when you buy the field from Naomi, you also get Ruth the Moabite, the widow of our dead relative, along with the responsibility to have children with her to carry on the family inheritance." Then the relative said, "Oh, I can't do that. I'd jeopardize my own family's inheritance. You go ahead and buy it. You can have my rights. I can't do it." Boaz married Ruth. She became his wife. By God's gracious gift, she conceived and had a son. Naomi took the baby and held him in her arms, cuddling him, cooing over him, waiting on him hand and foot. The neighborhood woman started calling him Naomi's baby boy, but his real name was Obed. Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David.
Ruth part 5, the famine's fairy tale ending, and it sure was. It's midnight on the threshing floor. and a young widow and an older eligible bachelor are sleeping together. It could have been a great scandal. Yet Ruth and Boaz, they maintained their integrity. Boaz knew he didn't have first dibs at marrying Ruth, so he wanted her to keep her good reputation. He said, "No one must know that you came to the threshing floor." And then, ever generous Boaz gave her more grain to bring home to her mother-in-law Naomi, saying, "Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed." What a generous, caring man. In the morning, Boaz hurried off to the city gate where business transactions took place. The first in line eligible bachelor in Ruth's family quickly passed on the opportunity to marry Ruth because it would jeopardize his future wealth. This was such good news for Boaz. He could marry his beautiful Ruth. And Ruth had a beautiful baby boy named Obed. The town's women recognized how blessed her mother-in-law Naomi was, and they told her that Ruth was more valuable than 7 sons. Ruth went from being a forbidden pagan Moabite woman to a woman in Christ's bloodline. When there is an unexpected fork in your road, cling to God. God will strengthen you as you walk through life and bless you with an unimaginable life. And now it is time to worship God through our offerings, our financial offerings and tithes. Please continue to support our churches financially to help us support the people in our communities through our caring ministries. And you can mail your checks to the addresses you see on the screen. And now I'd like to send you into your week with a blessing, a benediction. May you have tenacity, determination, patience, and strength as you wait for God's will in your life. With God, nothing is impossible. Go in peace to love and serve